Well, I'll go ahead and do our introduction. Andrew Rohrbaugh is here with us today, and he grew up in South Central Pennsylvania, received his BS in Environmental Studies at Gettysburg College, and an MS in Biology at Shippensburg University. He now works as an ecologist for the Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry, where he helps protect native wild plants and manages the invasive plants that threaten them. In his spare time, he enjoys gardening, hiking, hunting, and raising his two sons to enjoy the great outdoors. As we said earlier, this is going to be recorded. If everybody can remain muted, that would be great. And if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat box. And as soon as Andrew gets back, we'll turn it over to him.
All right, I wanted to grab my phone, which was charging, to make sure I can watch the time a little better. So hi everyone. My name is Andrew Rohrbaugh. As was mentioned, I work for Pennsylvania's Bureau of Forestry. We're the jurisdictional agency for native wild plants. We are not the jurisdictional agency for invasive plants, but obviously invasive plants are a major threat to our native plants. So I like to start off a lot of my presentations and slideshows and stuff like that with this picture. Not an invasive plant. This is our native pink lady slipper, a beautiful field that we have up here in Pennsylvania. But this actually was being heavily threatened by Japanese barberry. So we had to actually come in and remove the barberry. So this is the kind of thing that when we are talking about invasive plants, this is the kind of native plant that we're trying to protect. So as I already said, I work for our Bureau of Forestry in Pennsylvania, which is under our Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. And we're not just there to protect forests, but we're also protecting native wild plants. And so invasive plants are a major thing that we have to deal with on our lands for both of those factors. So running through a little bit of this, and this is probably a lot of review for a lot of folks, but I like to show this picture because this early detection rapid response picture, because I think this is key to what we're doing with invasive plants. You know, when you look at this, over time, you have a species that's been introduced. Let me actually see if I can do a laser pointer. You got a species that gets introduced into an area, and over time, it starts to increase. Eventually, someone realizes it's there, and it's a problem, and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse and increasing numbers until the public starts to become aware that, oh, this is a bad species here. You know, we've got kind of that green blindness up until now. And unfortunately, at that point in time, you know, it's pretty widespread. You know, you're really only getting local control. You know, your control costs are very high. You've got high acreage of infested areas. But one of the reasons that I like this image is because, you know, we can think about this as different levels of, you know, geographic area. So this could be your backyard. You know, a species could be introduced here. And hey, this is a new species from my backyard. I want to treat it when it's first introduced or when I first detect it before it increases number and becomes insurmountable almost in its effort. This could be your county park. This could be a right-of-way. This could be your entire state. So I really like to think about that for these species in terms of like how we're responding to them, because it's easier to respond to them quickly rather than let the problem grow. A different way of considering this is actually to think about, you know, I don't know about you guys, but we have a lot of areas where, you know, we have a huge infestation of, let's say this is Japanese barberry or Multiflora rose, you know, and it's a huge thicket and everyone wants to dive in and treat this huge thicket because it's so obviously a problem. But we always tell people, hang on a second, if you go in and you treat this, you're protecting a small area. Frankly, there's not a lot of native plants there, so you're going to wind up with kind of a scorched earth, which is going to favor a lot of other invasive plants who probably have seed banks in here, or the Multiflora rose is going to have a seed bank here, a heavy seed bank from years of reproducing. That's what's going to come back. So instead, maybe take a look out a little bit and find these isolated Multiflora rose patches, treat them before they have a chance to really spread, where there's still native plants around them to help outcompete any little seedlings that might be there, you know, and work your way in, protecting a much larger area, work your way into that core infestation. So we always tell people on our state forest lands, we're looking to treat Phragmites when it looks like this. It's a lot easier than when it looks like this. You know, you're not going to get ahead of this real easily. I mean, this is going to take years and years of major effort to treat. This is going to take 5 minutes and a Maddox or a shovel, you know? So we're Japanese knotweed, you know, treat it when it looks like this rather than when it looks like this. So really thinking about you guys doing this tree tending program, you know, and going out and treating some of these things by hand, you know, this is where you come in. You're treating some of these infestations, some of these problems before they can take down whole trees, before they can take down a whole area and really spread along a right of way or something like that. So I see this as a really important part of dealing with invasive species. So now to talk about a couple of the plants that they asked me to talk about. Multiflora rose. So here in this picture, you can actually see there's Japanese barberry growing down here. There's probably a couple other invasives that I could guess at in here, but what we're looking right here is this white flowered shrub, and that's Multiflora rose as you'll see it. Not really an early detection rapid response issue in any of our states here, unfortunately. But once again, when you're looking at your local park or you're looking at a right of way or something like that, you know, it behooves us to take care of those isolated patches before they can start to really form large infestations. So some general information about this species. This is a perennial shrub. So oftentimes it's one single or a small clump down at the base of like a woody base. It does not die back to the root every year. It's always got that woody stalk, and it grows a little bit bigger every year, kind of like a tree. But it's a lot more, it never grows as tall as a tree. It's always going to have kind of that vining, climbing structure to it that comes out and layers over. And so one of the reasons this one's an issue for you guys is because it can climb up to 15 feet into trees and kind of wind its way through the tree branches and cause damage to the tree. One of the reasons that I personally, this is one of my least favorite invasives to find out in the woods, is because it actually, the branches root. So you can see in this picture, the main plant that you see growing here is actually off to the side here, and its branches droop down here, and they'll root at the tip. So that's called layering. So now this plant will form a new multiflora rose. It'll send down roots here and start growing a whole nother plant here. And so what you wind up having is just this impenetrable mat of multiflora rose covered in spines. And it's literally one of my least favorite things to try to get through in the woods. So unfortunately, you know, that is an indicator of why this was planted heavily in the first place. It was put into hedgerows because farmers could put it along the edge of their fields to help keep animals in. It was also put into landscaping, and it was put out sometimes by, you see the PGC and BOF, that's our Pennsylvania Game Commission and our Bureau of Forestry. We planted a lot of this earlier last century because we thought, hey, forms big thickets and it produces little rose hips, so fruit. So it's got to be great for wildlife. Of course, subsequent research has indicated it's not really great for wildlife. It's not really great for any of our native plants or ecosystems. It's really a big problem. So in terms of identifying multiflora rose, one thing there's going to be kind of three main things. First of all, it's a rose. So for this species, and you got to note that it's got white flowers. It has compound leaves, which I'll go over in a second. It has rose thorns, which, you know, most people are fairly aware of what rose thorns kind of look like in general. And I'm really gonna hammer home the key identification for this one is this fringe stipule here. So I found this picture from Missouri Department of Conservation. when I talk about these compound leaflets, this is what's called a pinnately compound leaflet or leaf. And they typically, when people think of a leaf, they think this is a leaf. But in this species, this whole thing is one leaf, a compound leaf, with each of these being a little leaflet. So these can have anywhere between 5 or 11 even up on one leaf. And so here you can see this is the main stem of the leaf, and each of these little yellow offshoots is just a leaflet. So that's one way to identify this. You know, obviously I mentioned those rose thorns. In this species, it's very strong, recurved, rigid thorns, which is one of the reasons why I hate it so much. And the white flowers and these rose hips. And just, I put on here, and I should have mentioned this earlier, this is what we normally think of when we think of a leaf, just one simple leaf. This is a compound pinnate leaf. And down here in the bottom right, this is our native lupin species. This is also a compound leaf, but it's palmately compound because it's like a palm tree or like the fingers on your palm, they come out from one central point. But the real key takeaway for this species in terms of identifying it, particularly between it and other roses that you might find out, because we do have native roses, are these fringe stipules. So right where that compound leaflet or leaf comes in and connects to the stem, you'll see this kind of fleshy growth. And here's another image of it. And you'll notice that it's got a bunch of fringed, long, kind of like, it's a stipule, but it's got a bunch of long fringes growing off of it. So hopefully those pictures kind of show that pretty clearly. And further identification for this species, you know, you're looking at the rose hips, and you're also looking at, you'll probably see it growing, like I said, kind of in a hedgerow or along the edge of woods or even in an understory. And you see the main plant's growing here and it's arching out and over, and it might start trying to reroot here at the tips, or it might start trying to climb up into this tree here. We do have native roses, like I mentioned. So here are 3 of them. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but Carolina rose, pink flowers. It's got much hairier thorns, so it's not got that single recurved strong thorn. So you'll see on the right here, this is Multiflora rose, kind of a single strong thorn, versus the Carolina rose has much, you know, they do have some strong straight thorns in here, but a lot more of a hairy structure to it. And you'll also notice the stipule here at the bottom of the pinnately compound leaf. It has a little bit of fringing along the edge, but really not much. And it has this one single point at the top of each side of the stipule. So very different from what you can see with this very, the term is laciniate, if I'm saying that even correctly, but you know, very heavily fringed, long fringed stipule on the Multiflora rose. We have swamp rose, which actually, once again, it has a pink flower. Can't rely on that because you never know, at different times of years, you might not have flowers available or the plant might not be blooming, which is what makes botanizing so difficult, because the plants don't always grow where we think they should, and they don't always, you know, have all of the parts we need to identify them at the right time of year. Or this time of year, you're not going to do a lot of botanizing anyways. But once again, a key to look here is the stipule here at the bottom of the leaf, not fringed or hardly fringed at all, just kind of one fleshy point here. And this one actually has typically variable thorns as well, but typically just kind of one strong pair at the nodes of each stem. And swamp rose, pink flower once again, and it's hard to see here, but once again, not a heavily fringed stipule. So mostly just one kind of point here. You might also, if you're going out at particularly this time of year, you know, might come across something that looks like this, and that's got a pretty strong thorn to it, but this would be a blackberry or raspberry, which can also be very variable in their thorniness, their structures. So the key to looking on, once again, this one has a very white flower, so pretty similar to the Multiflora rose, but you'll notice if you can see the fruits, on this one, compound fruits, obviously very tasty. And you'll notice that their leaves are compound palmate leaflets. So they all come back to one central point here. Similarly, you might see, oh, I'm sorry, that was a picture I had showing the main leaf stem and then everything coming from one point for the blackberries and raspberries. And similarly, you might see greenbrier, very thorny stem. But on this one, if you look at the right time of year, you're going to see simple leaves, like a maple leaf, just one single leaf, and blue fruit on it. And also, you'll see the thorns aren't really recurved like a multiflora rose. So treatment for this one, you know, mechanical removal is very possible for this one. I mean, I know that's what most folks are doing for this program. You really do have to focus on trying to get the roots. I mean, cutting it back is going to help, but getting the roots is always ideal for this species. Otherwise, it will just regrow. I like to tell people that mowing or fire does help with this species because it knocks back the main part of the plant. And I know you guys aren't going to be using herbicide much, but I just kind of wanted to go over it briefly because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about using herbicide, and a lot of people think of it just as kind of like nuking an area, but you can be pretty targeted with herbicide. So for this one, typically we use either glyphosate or triclopyr. We can do basal bark or cut stump. You notice this guy is doing what we call foliar application, where he's spraying the leaves with the herbicide, and you can do that early in the spring. It's not the best time to apply the herbicide to kill the plant, but you'll notice there's not a lot of other stuff greening up yet. So he can get spray on that plant without killing too many other native plants in the area. Another thing about knocking this down is if you did want to use a chemical to treat it, you know, knocking it down and letting it regrow, he's spraying right up in the air. And I wouldn't do that. I'd certainly be wearing a little bit more PPE than he is if I was spraying that high up in the air. Another thing I wanted to mention for this one is you might see rosette disease on this one, which is caused by an RNA virus and it's spread by mites. So you'll see kind of this elongation, reddish appearance, kind of a witch's broom. And it can impact some cultivated roses. And unfortunately, it's not really controlling multiflora rose. I've heard varying accounts, and I've seen it do a good job in some areas, but most areas it's not doing what we would hope it would. So on to Japanese honeysuckle. This is another species you guys will see quite often. A little bit more of a strong vine species rather than a shrub like multiflora rose. Once again, not unusual in our area, but on your smaller geographic scale, it could be certainly a priority. And oftentimes you look at an infestation, it looks kind of something like this, where you know it's maybe been mowed and it's shorter in this area, but then as it starts to get into the trees, it starts to take over and form these mats over top of everything. So key identifying characteristics for this one, it has yellow and white flowers. Actually, as a kid, we always used to pull these off and pull a little drop of nectar out of them. So, you know, I have some conflicting feelings about killing one of my childhood memories, but you know, now I know a little bit better. The leaves are opposite, which means the leaves are lined up opposing each other against the stem. They typically are round, as you can see here, fairly rounded. Some of the, I'll go over some of the other leaves in a second. And they have this blackish bluish fruit. Particularly when they're younger, their leaves can be a lot more lobed and almost serrated looking like this, so they can have variable leaves. And another thing to think about with this one is, this is a picture from later in winter. I don't think they could really be considered evergreen, but they are semi-evergreen. They keep their leaves a lot longer than a lot of other native species. So not to go over too much of this, but once again, this was introduced for erosion control, wildlife, ornamental reasons. You know, you can see from this picture, low growing over most of this ground, but then kind of swamping over everything else, including this little house. This one will send out runners that spread from its roots. And once again, the seeds are spread by birds and mammals. Only one real likely look-alike for this one, and it is our native vining honeysuckle. So Lonicera sempervirens. There are other native shrub honeysuckles that I've listed there, but sempervirens is really our one really look-alike vining honeysuckle. On the left, you'll see this is its normal color, kind of a pinkish coral color. It's called coral or trumpet honeysuckle. And there is a variety you'll see out there, which is yellow. I have that growing right outside my window here, actually, and I love it. The hummingbirds love it as well. So to tell the difference between the native and non-native varieties, Japanese honeysuckle has what we call axillary flowers, which means, as you can see, the stem here is growing here, and the flowers come out from the axes of the stem. So they're opposite of each other, coming off the stem on both sides. Whereas our native honeysuckles, the stem comes up this way, comes to a stop at this kind of odd disc-shaped cupped fused leaf here, and then the flowers form it terminally at the end of the vine. So once again, you can see that here. Here's the stem coming up, hits the end, hits this cupped leaf, and then the flowers come off in the end. Over here, same thing. The stem comes along here, hits the end of the stem, and then the flowers come off at the end. So hopefully that's apparent to you guys. For this one, I think of this one as mechanical removal is generally difficult, but some of the other folks on here have said that they think it's relatively easy to get the roots out for this one. And so to that, I have to say I haven't done that nearly as much as I'd like to, because with our program, we wind up kind of typically resorting a little bit more than I'd like to foliar treatment for herbicide. But I will say, like on this one, you can use glyphosate and triclopyr again. If you are going to use herbicide, you can kind of cut it short and then use some of those other options to use a little less herbicide. Or you can do that foliar treatment early in the spring or late in the fall. Once again, probably not the best time to kill the plant, but a good time to treat it with herbicide without causing a lot of damage to other plants. I do want to say that if you're treating this one by hand, you cannot just mow it. You can't just mow it back and hope that it's going to go away. Eventually, it'll form a mat like you see in this picture, and it'll just keep spreading by roots. So if you are going to treat it mechanically, you really have to get down, cut it down to the soil surface, get in there and get some of those roots out. And be consistent coming back and revisiting that. So just to finish off a few things here, some of the tools of the job to get at some of these, I personally really enjoy the Fisker's loppers, the long loppers that you see here. I was just using mine earlier tonight to trim some fruit trees in my yard. And they've got some good leverage to them to cut some larger, thicker stuff. But one of the problems is when you're dealing in a little shrub or thicket, or you're kind of in a tight spot, it's really hard to get them into some of those tight areas. You're running out of room to handle them. So hand loppers go a long way. Even if you're just trying to get through a patch of multiple rows to get down at the base of the plant, having those hand loppers just to work your way in to cut out some of those surrounding branches so you can get to the base is helpful. Personally, I use a machete or brush hook quite often. I'm not going to recommend that to people because they're death traps. And every time I use them, I think this is going to be the time that I wind up cutting my leg wide open because I'm swinging it and I'm sweating and it slips out of my hand, or I hit a stick and it goes flying, or I swing it and I'm like, wow, I came close to my leg that time. So don't recommend it. I'm probably not going to be smart enough to stop using it myself, but that's because I'm young and I'm immortal still. Every year I feel a little bit less like that, so I don't recommend it to people. There will come a year when I will finally either cut my leg or decide I've had enough, I'm done with them. I don't recommend them. And once you get down to the base of some of these plants, once you've trimmed back enough to get to the base, a Maddox like this, even just using the pick side to get under something and really pry up some rocks out of your way, and then this end to get get some soil dug out of the way, or a narrow spade to try and get under some of those root systems and really start to pry up some of those plants and dig around the base to get the most of the roots. I wanted to mention this because I see this quite often, weed wrenches. Our program has used this because we work in some areas with rare native plants where we're being particularly careful about, disturbance and chemical. My experience with them is that they have their place. So you'll see the person on the left has something, it might be like a buckthorn or something that they're pulling out, and it's got a discrete base to it. It's easy to get this clamped around. They've got room to work. And it probably works. They work fairly well for that. Whereas on the right, you see this, they've trimmed back this bush honeysuckle down, so they've got room to work. And they're probably going to get this one out okay. But that weed wrench is not going to be able to get around the base of this clump. And I've seen multiflora rows that would be easy to use a weed wrench for when they're smaller. And I've seen some big clumps that it wouldn't work at all. So that's something to think about for that. I wanted to mention, like I said, I know you guys aren't going to be using chemicals, but I did want to mention that if you decide to go that way or you're working with a different program, there's a lot of poor treatment of chemicals out there. And so I just wanted to harp home on this because I think they're a very useful tool and I think they get a black eye a lot. Proper application is important. Having the right equipment, the right PPE, the right gear in terms of backpack sprayers or bottles, knowing the chemical that you're using. Glyphosate, everyone thinks of as Roundup, kills every plant. So you got to be very, very careful how you're using it. Triclopyr, however, is only for broadleaf plants. So you can use that a little bit more, in some different situations. You have to think about what care you're using. Is it water? Is it oil? There are different situations that call for different carriers. You have to have proper certification. You have to follow the law follow the label with the proper rates. And in order to do that properly, you need to calibrate your equipment so you know how much you're spraying. So if anyone is interested in looking into that, there's a great website there, Penn State Backpack Sprayer Calibration. Timing is really important for this. Like I've mentioned to you that there are times that you can treat some of these species with herbicide where it might not be the best time to use the herbicide, but it's good to avoid other species. And surfactants and dyes are helpful as well to be able to note, you do a good job getting treatment and note where you're spraying. So once again, I'll mention Penn State Extension actually has a great, it talks about using different herbicide treatments, but you can also use these little graphs they've got for some of these species to show, hey, I want to go out and identify multiflora rose or Japanese honeysuckle. When is it typically flowering and ripening seed? So that'll give you a good idea. Or when does it leaf out so I can go start to identify it when it's first growing. And once again, with that chemical and treatment, like I said, I know that's not something you guys are used to doing a lot of, but a lot of people think of just the foliar application where you're just kind of scorched earthy in a huge patch of plants. We oftentimes with Bureau of Forestry, we do basal bark where you're spraying just the bottom stem of a plant, or we do cut stump where you're spraying just a little chemical around the stump, or hack and squirt. So just some other suggestions, not something you're probably going to be doing with this program, but I like to mention it because I think better, smarter use of these chemicals is an acceptable practice. So with that, hopefully you guys have learned a little bit about some of these two species. I won't leave this up for long because no one wants to stare at my face any longer. These are my wife and kids, and we are at an overlook on the Susquehanna River. And behind us is a field of Oriental bittersweet, which I cropped out of the picture. No one else sees that except me because I've learned to identify that plant and I know what it means. And so now you guys know a few more plants that unfortunately you will be cursed to see every time you take your family out to a beautiful overlook and your wife's like, oh, it's so beautiful. And you're just like, those are all invasive plants and they're killing all the native plants. You too can be that Debbie Downer on family trips. But that's my email address there at the bottom if you have any questions. And so folks, here are some additional resources and I'm gonna leave this up. well, I guess I take any questions if anyone has any, but feel free to take a look at some of these different resources for more information. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate you guys learning about these plants and trying to tackle them. It's a thankless job, but I want to thank you for it. So thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, we've
That's
had
very
many
nice.
praises there, and one person said, excellent, succinct, relevant presentation. Wish all my Zoom meetings went like this.
I don't know that I've ever, I can show the I haven't been following it, but yeah, I don't know that anyone's ever said I'm succinct when I'm talking about things.
Well, thank you for being so tonight. Heidi, did you want to read the questions?
Yeah, we had a couple of questions. The first one, which I thought was really a good question for everybody to hear, was the person noted that in the photos that were shown of the native roses, they had red stems or seemed to have red stems, and wanted to know if that was a good way to differentiate it from the multiflora rose.
I personally would not. Since we have the time here, I can run back real quick. That would not be a characteristic that I would key in on. I mean, you can see that maybe it looks a little redder, but the multiflora rose stems can look a little browner too as they become woody with age. Yeah, I wouldn't key in on that because you look at this picture in the background and a lot of these stems are green. There's some red here, but a lot of these are fairly green. So that would not be a characteristic that I would look for.
Okay.
Might help.
Another question was regarding the native honeysuckles and the Japanese honeysuckle. Do you have any good tips on identifying that before it flowers?
Yes.
Or it starts to produce buds?
Yes. And I'm actually ashamed that I did not put this in here. Well, I know it's true for the bush honeysuckles. The bush honeysuckles are often hollow in the stem. And I'd have to look that up because I want to say that the Japanese honeysuckle has a hollow pith, but now that I think about that, I can't quite say that for certain. So for those of you that I know the bush honeysuckles, non-natives all have, if you cut the branch back here, you'll notice there's a little hollow space in the middle of the stem, whereas our natives are not like that. I can't say that for certain off the top of my head for the vines. I want to say it's true, but I shouldn't say that because I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head now. In terms of other differences, I think if you're looking at a plant, you know, you should be able to start picking up some differences. Like I said, if I was looking, I've lost daylight now, but if I was looking out at my native vining honeysuckle, my native John Clayton coral honeysuckle, I would still be able to see, even though it's long past flowering, I would still be able to see where those flowers and fruits were coming off the plant. I would still be able to see some of those cupped leaves at the end, those fused leaves. So that's what I would key in on in terms of vegetative differences.
And I think one thing for us, at least for me to say to all of our volunteers, is that we really don't have native honeysuckle in the area growing wildly. So hopefully the confusion would come up is if somebody had a native honeysuckle in their yard, and hopefully they would know that. I don't know if Margaret has any comment regarding that.
I agree. I don't think you're likely to run into it in the wild.
I'm a stickler for putting some of these native lookalikes in here, simply because I don't want to be the person that goes and tells people to go scorched earth on vining honeysuckles, even though 99.999% of the chance they're going to be right in killing it. I just fear that at some point someone's going to go out and spray one of those last patches of native vining honeysuckle or hand pull it when they're on a hike, not knowing like, hey, this is one of the few of our native variety that the deer haven't browsed.
So I think it's good for everybody to know that it's there. It's just going to be a lot more difficult to try to differentiate it.
I put everyone's mind at ease. 99.999% chance if you're on a right of way, if you're doing some of this work tree tending, it's gonna be Japanese honeysuckle. If you're in a really nice, pristine native area with an understory and some nice cliffs and some native plants around, you might want to double check.
Okay. And then the last question you kind of answered was regarding what the word basal bark or the term basal bark meant as a herbicide treatment.
And I know that's not what you guys are doing, and I'm just, like I said, I think people think herbicide and think chemicals and, scorched earth. And there are ways that we handle chemicals on our state forest land that I like to think are a little bit more responsible. That being said, no one's thrilled to have to break that tool out of the toolbox. But I was treating invasives around one of our few three-bird orchid populations. And I'm afraid of what happens if we just let those invasives take over. So we were using basal bark herbicide treatments in the off season to try to minimize any impact to that orchid. I wouldn't feel comfortable going in and trying to dig out the invasives around those orchids. I feel a little bit more comfortable doing, off-season basal bark treatment. But like I said, I just kind of felt like that's a possibility used, not necessarily for your program, but for people to be aware of.
So can you explain what basal bark treatment is?
Yes. So you see different options here. Everyone thinks of typically foliar application of herbicide where you're spraying the leaves. But oftentimes our foresters, when we're dealing with trees or even really large shrub infestations, they will do something like hack and squirt, where you're hacking into the bark and you're spraying a little bit of chemical into that, which will get down into the roots and kill that entire tree or shrub. We do cut stump. As soon as you cut a stump, as soon as it's fresh, you can spray the herbicide around the edge, which will be translocated down into the roots to kill the root system. And basal bark is one where you actually use typically triclopyr, and you use a oil carrier. So it's oil-based, it's not water-based. You spray the bottom 12 to 18 inches of the stem, and that actually penetrates through the bark into the living tissue of the plant, gets translocated down into the roots, killing the root system. Season-wise, you can do basal bark almost year-round. Early spring, you're going to get the least amount of treatment, because if you think about it, early spring, that plant is pushing energy up, pushing fluid and water and everything up from the root system to the leaves. So it's not pulling that herbicide down. You won't get as good of a kill in the off season, I found, in winter. But like I said, I like to do that sometimes late fall, early winter, even knowing that I won't get quite the kill rate, but I can be extra secure and not damaging any of our native plants at that time. Because I have done herbicide treatments for the betterment of native plant species, rare native plant species, and woken up in the middle of the night 2 months later in the middle of the winter thinking, oh gosh, I hope that went well. I hope I didn't have any negative repercussions on the rare plants. So letting me sleep at night is, I'll do a couple treatments a couple years in a row. But so that's for volunteers, for people just doing this on their own. That hand treatment will work for these species. You just have to make sure you get the roots. Any other questions? Oh, I see someone said, do you add the coloring? Yeah, for a lot of these, we do recommend using dye if you're using chemical. So I also saw someone mention about using chemical around a tree critical root zone when the tree is dormant. Depends on the chemical. There are some chemicals that I wouldn't I wouldn't recommend using because they have a lot more soil activity and can damage trees. One of our foresters found that out the hard way. But for typically triclopyr glyphosate, that's not nearly much of an issue. So, sorry, I apologize. I don't mean to go on with herbicide.
No, people were asking, so they want to know. Thank you.
And I appreciate, like I said, I appreciate everyone doing the work by hand as well, because I know that's the hard task. And we have areas of our state forest where we do it that way. So it's just challenging with manpower, and I'm glad that you have volunteers that are willing to do it.
I've noticed with the Multiflora rosa on my own property that if it's a certain age, like not huge, but not really young, and I cut it at the base, that does sometimes kill it.
Yeah, if it's young and doesn't have much root reserve, yeah.
At least
I will oftentimes, I think this is overkill, so I don't normally mention it as part of the, normal MO. But if I pull a barberry or a multiflora rose from a site, if I just hand pull it or have something big under it, I will often drape it in a nearby tree or bush to keep it off the ground, just because I'm afraid of it trying to like reroot or root sprout, tip root back into the ground. I think that's overkill. Totally, I don't know that I've never really seen it happen, but I don't oftentimes get back to a lot of these areas where I'm doing management to recheck them year in, year out, or I don't get back to them for a year at least. So if I'm taking the effort to pull it out, I want to make sure it stays dead.